it in fiction is because it doesn't really happen in real life. Probably the strongest person to ever run for president as an independent in American history was Teddy Roosevelt in 1912. And all he succeeded in doing was splitting the Republican vote and electing Woodrow Wilson. So my sense is it could happen, it probably won't happen. Here's the other thing you gotta remember. I read, my dissertation director at Emory University was a guy named Dan Carter. Dan Carter wrote the definitive biography of George Wallace. It's called The Politics of Rage. If you ever want to kind of understand the Wallace phenomenon in '68, where, by the way, when he got into the race, he was getting 26% of the vote in 1968. On election day, it had fallen down to 13.5% of the vote. But until Perot came along, from 1912 until Perot, Wallace was the high watermark for an independent candidate or a third-party candidate. And there's this really funny line in that book where one of Wallace's political operatives, keep in mind, these guys have been Democrats their entire life. I mean, Wallace had never run as anything but a Democrat. He runs as an independent, and they're dealing with all this Sturm and Drang and internal conflict and all these trying to balance. You know, it's kind of like the Tea Party people. There's like 50 groups, and they're all kind of, they don't like each other. And it's hard to really corral and discipline an independent movement. They're anti-party. They don't want to follow anybody's direction. Not just the Republicans and the Democrats, but you. You know, they're not going to listen to anybody. So this guy was bemoaning this, and Wallace is reported to have said to this is the problem with independent campaigns. They attract a lot of crazy people. You know, ha ha. But that's what happens. You know, it's self-selective, and it's really hard to run an efficient independent campaign because they're not going to listen to direction.
You have to have a lot of money like Perot.
You just have to have a lot of money like Perot. And the problem with that is you waste a lot of it. Yes, ma'am.
Well, the healthcare bill was never perfect, but it was feasible, and now I agree with you. I don't think it can pay for itself, but didn't it get that way because of Republican legislators hacking away at it in order to obstruct any Obama's success at the risk and expense of the American people if it were to get passed?
No, I really don't think so. I think that it got there for the same reason that health care always gets there. Remember, this is not our first bite at the apple, okay? Democrats have been trying to pass comprehensive health care reform since the late 40s. And we've gone through episodic sort of rounds of this. In the late 40s under Truman, the mid-60s under Johnson, the 70s a little bit, in the Carter years, particularly when Ted Kennedy was getting ready to run for president and was pushing it very hard. The 90s under Clinton, and now it's again. So this is not the first time this has happened. This has been happening for 50 years. And here's why comprehensive health care is so hard. And I'm not taking any credit for this. I was at a briefing in Washington for, you know, just conservative policy wonk types. And there was a woman from the Heritage Foundation who's their healthcare expert. And I never really understood this until she explained it. She had worked on CHIP. She had worked on the Clinton healthcare plan. She said, here's what most people don't understand. There are always two aspects to healthcare reform. The first is the plan or the proposal. This is what I'm going to do. You know, in the 80s, it was catastrophic healthcare. So senior citizens were going to be able to buy catastrophic health care insurance, and it was going to be subsidized by the federal government. That way we can be sure that no senior citizen is ever going to lose their home, ever going to lose their inheritance because they didn't have insurance for that catastrophe of a cancer diagnosis or a stroke or something like that. CHIPS was covering every child in America up to 300% of poverty, so well above the Medicaid benefit threshold. And there's always a plan, okay? But then there's a second silo, and she called it the pay-fors. So over here I have my plan. In the case of Obama, I'm going to cover 31 million people. Over here are my pay-fors. How am I going to pay for it? Well, in the end, there's really only 3 ways to pay for this. Okay? One is budget cuts. You take cuts elsewhere and you apply them to the plan. That's what they're doing with this smoke and mirrors $500 billion they say they're going to take out of Medicare, which everybody knows will never come out. It's vapor. The second is taxes. Problem is, which taxes? Is it going to be a payroll tax? Is it going to be an income tax? Is it going to be a tax on so-called Cadillac plans? Well, guess what? Every time you touch one of those taxes, bang, there's pushback. So Reid wants to tax so-called gold-plated Cadillac plans because the argument is those gold-plated plans are driving healthcare costs. That's a debatable proposition, but that's what many policy experts believe. Well, the problem with that is that all the labor union leaders go nuts because they've been sitting there in collective bargaining negotiations for 20 years when wages have been static, trying to keep their members happy by delivering these benefits, and now you're going to tax them. Or, thirdly, you require co-pays or premiums. Those are the only 3 places to get the money. And every time you do that, it blows up. And usually it's not the plan that blows it up, it's the pay-fors. You know, if I walk in here tonight and I say, you know what, everybody here is going to be able to go to a doctor anytime they want to for free and never get a bill. What do you say? That's great. But what if I tell you that costs $3 trillion over the next 10 years? And what if I then tell you that the only way I can pay for it is, you know, say by increasing the Medicare payroll tax by 2%? Then all of a sudden every small business in America goes up in arms. And that's the problem. You know, when David Axelrod said this weekend on the Sunday shows, he said, well, you got to remember when you test every individual element of this, the people like it. Well, of course. It's like me saying, I'm going to give you a popsicle. You know, 80% of the people go, I'd like that. But what happens if you say, yeah, but the popsicle is going to cost $80,000? Then people go, well, then I don't want the popsicle. And that's how voters assess these things. And that's the problem. Republican or Democrat, liberal or centrist, new Democrat or old Democrat, whatever you are, in the end, you got to pay for this. And it's hard. Yeah?
I'm curious, you've talked a lot about the problems and shortcomings of this plan, but what would be another alternative plan that would work better and that would solve some of the problems you've talked about?
Well, you know, I think one thing you could do to cover the uninsured, the chronically uninsured, is allow for some kind of a Medicaid or Medicare buy-in. You could take the existing programs that you've already got and people would be able to buy into them, and you could provide subsidies for that. That would be much cheaper than doing what they're proposing to do. Now, the problem is that here's why Obama didn't do that, in my opinion. Republicans basically proposed that. The problem is, we get back to the pay-fors, right? How do they get into the system? They buy in. It costs them money. We don't mandate it, we offer it. Well, what happens when you offer a benefit that you have to pay for? Not very many people pay for it. They'd rather just wait until they're sick. So the Republican plan, the CBO found, was only going to cover 4 or 5 million of the 40 to 45 million uninsured. If you want to get to the 31 million number, which is what Obama wanted, that's where you end up with the big government.